Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum. The ISF podcast is hosted by ISF CEO Steve Durbin, and every episode he brings listeners features timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. As our host, Steve is normally the interviewer on the podcast, but today he's interviewed by BBC journalist and longtime ISF podcast friend Nick Witchell. Steve and Nick discuss AI and its impact on security, as well as data integrity and trust in an age of disinformation.
Steve, I'd like to start talking about artificial intelligence. Now, how far do you sense we are from AI that is essentially indistinguishable from the human mind?
It's a good question, Nick, because I think a lot of people are asking this at the moment because they're wondering so much, because we're connected to machines in pretty much everything that we do. You know, you see cameras when you walk down the street. What are they doing? How are they doing it? If we go back a little bit, then you'll remember that I always used to talk about the fact that artificial intelligence was actually nothing more than machine learning. I think we've actually come past that point now. So we are moving to the stage where we are approaching very much more what some people might describe as real artificial intelligence. So the ability for the computer, if you like, to pick up information, to then analyze that information and then react or behave accordingly. So we've seen that with people like Instagram, TikTok, Meta to a certain extent, really making use of these things. Google, of course, has been doing this and investigating it for quite some while. In terms of that overall maturity, I've always described where we're at now as entering those sort of teenage years where things are becoming a little bit more difficult. We don't actually know how AI is going to end up. Is it going to sort of breeze through the teenage years, or is it going to be a little bit more difficult to get out the other side? So how far are we from it? Probably a lot closer than some people might like to think. But I think that it raises all sorts of other questions then around how we manage that and how we really make the best use of where we're headed.
It's an interesting analogy to think of AI being in the teenage years, because, of course, teenage years can be quite troublesome, and all sorts of issues of responsibility arise, don't they, at that point? So who should be charged with the whole question of what is and what isn't ethical in terms of AI? Should it be corporate entities or elected bodies or who?
I think it's a little bit of a mishmash of all of those. So I think it is big tech, because they're the ones who are actually driving forward in that space, and you would expect them to behave in a certain way, in a responsible way. But they probably need help in doing that. So I think then we are talking about some legislation, regulation around what should be done, what it should look like. Transparency is really important for me in that particular space. Understanding how data is going to be used, how it's going to be added to other data points, and what we're going to do with it when it comes out the other side, if you like. But I think there's another piece too, which is the individual. Because we have to take responsibility as well for the way in which we use and share our data and the data that we interact with. So you're absolutely right about the teenage years being difficult years. I think they are difficult for everybody because we're all interfacing with AI and what will be a new era of computing.
So let's think specifically about the responsibilities that CISOs and their security teams should have. What should they, at a minimum, in your view, what do they need to know about AI and how it's going to impact on their world?
I think they need to understand the way in which their organization wishes to use AI. So I would come at it more from that perspective rather than what do they need to know about AI itself. So they need a very intimate understanding of the business direction that organizations are headed in and the role that AI has to play in that. Now, I've talked a lot about artificial intelligence being a real potential solution in some areas of cyber. So, it does mean that computers are able to do things that we as people are no longer very good at because we simply can't sift through the volumes of data. So I think that using AI to solve some of those problems, clearly everybody would probably vote for that. And the CISO needs to understand then how they can manage that But, in a lot of large organizations, there are probably departments who are looking into this already. Marketing departments and R&D and so on. So I think the CISO needs to learn from colleagues across in other departments and then link it through to where the business is going.
And the CISO surely also needs clear direction from board level, from above, as to what that company or organization's attitude is, how that company or organization intends to use AI.
That's absolutely right. And if they're not getting it, they need to ask for it. I think we're entering this stage of, again, a maturing of the CISO position, where if a business is entirely dependent upon data and information, then the Chief Information Security Officer needs to be involved in those discussions. Not to prevent things, but so that they have this broad-based understanding of how it all fits together from a strategic perspective, what the board is anticipating and expecting that the CISO is going to do, and very much more importantly, so that they can put forward some of their ideas about some of the challenges and how to overcome them. Because we keep talking about resilient organizations, cyber-resilient organizations. You can't be cyber-resilient if your CISO doesn't know the first thing about your strategy and how you're going to be using data going forward.
Let's turn, if we may, to broader questions of trust and responsibility. We live in the era of fake news, of alleged manipulation of election results and all that sort of thing. So how really does society begin to know what data it can trust anymore?
It's a good question and a really difficult question to answer, because I think the reality is that we all have to become a little bit more skeptical, a little bit more cynical about the data that we're seeing. We talked some years ago about the fact that we will make decisions based on trusted information, where maybe somebody that I know on Twitter has recommended something and so therefore I trust it. Well, now I need to ask myself whether or not that really is the person that I know on Twitter, or is it a bot? Or has it been manipulated in some shape or form to get me to decide on what I'm really going to do? So I think it is about us individually establishing our own filters about what we do trust, what we don't trust. It's about us establishing our own comfort level with what data we want to share, and therefore what we could reasonably expect back. And I think there is an onus on the people who are collecting that data to increase the transparency about how they're going to use it. And I think within a very short space of time, we are going to get to the point where we begin to understand these things very much better. And so we're going to be able to ask the right questions. We're going to be able then to determine whether or not we want to stay with a particular provider, or whatever it might be, or whether we want to opt out and go and do something different with another third party. So I think as individuals, as users, we're going through this very rapid maturity process as well.
We have the huge digital content providers. They are huge companies. They have a huge responsibility, and it raises questions as to whether they are measuring up to that responsibility. I think we've had in the UK the recent ruling in the case of Molly Russell, and I think it's clear from that there is a demand for more to be done to legislate and protect children in particular from harmful online content. The responsibility doesn't solely lie with the digital content providers like Meta, but how do you define what is their responsibility?
I think you're right. I don't think it does just lie with them. I think that there is a huge responsibility on the part of parents, for instance, when we talk about the way in which children use technology. If we're going to give iPads or tablets to babies to keep them quiet or to amuse themselves, then once they get to a certain point where they understand what they're actually doing, we as parents will need to do something much more positive to make sure that they're using the equipment correctly. So I don't think we can offload responsibility for everything onto big tech and tech providers. I do think, though, that tech providers have to behave more responsibly as well. And I think we saw not that long ago a number of tech providers really chasing the money, if I could put it that way. Data has a value, so let me monetize it and increase my return to shareholders and so on. We've come out the other side of that particular era, if you like, fortunately. And I think we are now talking about much more responsibility that they have to display there. And it is about transparency. It is about being very clear about how they're using things, and government really has to hold their feet to the fire through regulation.
But it is the case, is it not, that people have been saying this for quite a few years now, have been looking to the tech providers, the content providers, to take a more responsible attitude. Do you really see any evidence that they are measuring up in the way that you've just been describing?
I don't think they have stepped up as much as we would like. I think they are a little bit slow. And that's probably being a bit kind. But I think that the more that we see people like European Union, for instance, bringing in certain legislation, the more we see cases coming to court, the more public opinion begins to switch. I think those are the sorts of things, all combined. I don't think any one of them on their own will do it, but I think that will force them along that road. But no, you're right, they are a little bit late to the party.
Let's talk about another area of trust and responsibility in the context of our fundamental democracy, and that is e-voting. Now, is e-voting a good thing in your view, or does it increase unacceptably the potential for fraud and rigging and manipulation?
I think that on the positive side with e-voting, what it does do is make the ability to vote available to people who perhaps otherwise wouldn't be able to do it. Now, critics of e-voting will say to me, what about postal voting? Why can't we go down that road? And of course, you could still continue with that. But I do think e-voting opens up the vote to a percentage of the population that really haven't been able to access that democratic right. So I think that from that perspective, it is a good thing. I think to the other point, though, around, is it completely fraud-proof, which I think is the question you're asking. And the answer to that is, of course, it's not. Nothing is completely fraud-proof. So what we then have to do is to make sure that our systems are sufficiently capable to withstand attack, that we have a fallback approach, that we have practiced and rehearsed, so that if something does go wrong, we know how to respond and get the systems back up and running again. Because everything that you put online, everything that you put out there, and from a technology standpoint, of course, if it has value, is going to be attractive to somebody, either to manipulate, and that was a big discussion, wasn't it, around the US elections not that long ago, or to exfiltrate some of that data, store it, and use it for other purposes at some point in the future. So I think security becomes even more important when we move into e-voting, but I do think that it does open up this democratic right to a much broader proportion of the population.
These are issues that we will be discussing for many years to come. But for the moment, Steve Durbin, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Nick.
Many thanks to Nick Witchell for contributing to the conversation this week. We'll be back with a new episode in a week. In the meantime, as always, we ask that you take 10 seconds to pull up this podcast on whatever device you're listening and give us a 5-star rating. If you have a little more time, you can even write a quick review. That helps other listeners who might enjoy our content find us. And we also want to make sure to introduce you to the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, which goes in depth on the hottest topics in information security. In every episode, ISF analysts hand-select active security professionals from ISF member organizations to discuss how the implementation of ISF research is uniquely applied to their real-world context. We hope you'll listen, and of course, we'll put a link to that show in our show notes. If there's a topic or a question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. The ISF podcast is produced by TalkBox and Tavia Gilbert, with music by Alexander Filipiak, senior producer Katie Flood, mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Thanks for listening.